Vince Lombardi. There have been multiple documentaries on YouTube about both the coach and the man behind the myth, and many of them have been excellent, but there's a problem that occurs when trying to recount a person's life: revisionist history. Although mostly unintentional, it muddies the waters and leads to false narratives others later accept. For example, it is said Lombardi being hired to coach Green Bay was problematic as he'd only really been a head coach at the high school level. You will see some very knowledgeable people make the claim Lombardi was seen as a gambler. There's a problem with this though. It mostly isn't true. Yes, the recounting of his coaching career is accurate, however the sentiment at the time was that Lombardi was actually a promising hire. Look no further than the Green Bay Press-Gazette's coverage from January 29, 1959. Nothing negative, even indirectly, is said about him, and there are even 2 articles on the same page talking about what a good choice he was to helm the Packers. And this is one example of something that sounds accurate, but if you fact check it, the reality is the opposite. And that's what the purpose of this documentary is to see what people were actually thinking and saying at the time, instead of the repackaged, retold version of what people think they remember happening. This will pour over literally hundreds and hundreds of articles from the Green Bay Press-Gazette's archives, and to show you just how much, here's only a partial look at the articles I've used, and that's just for materials in the 50s. In the process, some stories about his life will get outright debunked or corrected if it was a partial truth, or confirmed if it turns out sports historians got it right the first time. Now the caveat to this is, just because you're taking something straight from the paper when the story was brand new, doesn't automatically mean that was true either. Sometimes the real facts won't surface until years later, so these accounts are not infallible and come with their own set of problems. And unfortunately, for the first few decades of his life, there understandably wasn't that much written about him, so his childhood and first decade and a half of adulthood will mostly rely on articles and books written years later, but whenever possible, a contemporary source will be used, such as the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, a paper local to Lombardi's childhood home. And whenever it can be done, I will be using Lombardi's own words. You will frequently hear me say Lombardi wrote or Lombardi said, and that will especially be the case once we get to the year 1959. Now, let's get started. This is the life and times of Vince Lombardi and how he changed the course of Green Bay and the Packers forever. On June 11, 1913, Vincent Thomas Lombardi was born to Enrica Lombardi and Matzie Izzo in the second-story bedroom of the family home in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. His father, who went by the nickname Harry, was born in Salerno, Italy in 1889. One source lists 1890, however the gravestone laid by his family lists November 26, 1889. At the age of 2, Lombardi's father moved to the United States, where they settled in Brooklyn. Lombardi's mother, Matzie, was born December 17, 1891, in Manhattan. However, she, like Harry, had immigrant parents who had come from Italy too. As a young man, Lombardi's father went by the nickname Moon in reference to his round face. As an adult, he would later get another nickname, Old 5x5, which evidently was something said behind his back, this time in reference to him having a square-like body, although he actually stood taller than 5 feet, reaching to about 5'5". One of the more interesting and potentially surprising things about his father were the abundance of tattoos he had. In particular, he had the word work tattooed on one hand and play inked on the other. Whether or not his father regretted getting the tattoos later in life is unclear. However, it was reported that Harry's mother got upset and ordered him to wash them off. Regardless, he had other tattoos and even allegedly had one on his chest of an American bald eagle that was never completed. Despite Harry being born in Italy, he rarely spoke Italian that was fully Americanized, never going publicly by his birth name Enrico. Harry met his future wife Maddie through her brother Frank, who was a barber that cut Harry's hair. By 1920, Harry and his brother had their own business selling meat, where he would wake up at 4:30 every morning to make the commute to Lombardi Brothers Wholesalers. Years later, when Vince and his younger brother Joe were old enough, they would carry the slabs of meat to help out with the shop, and when asked if they lifted weights, they would jokingly said, "Only meat." One day, however, Lombardi caught himself on one of the meat hooks and vowed never to work there again. This work supported Harry's family, which consisted of his wife Maddie, his sons Vince, Harold, and Joe, and his daughters Madeline and Claire. And if that wasn't crowded enough, Lombardi's mother came from a big family where she was one of 13 children, and as adults, they all settled close by. It was in this crowded family atmosphere that Vince Lombardi was brought up. And being from a Catholic Italian-American family, full of weddings, birthday parties, picnics, and Sunday dinners. At gatherings, his mother's sisters Nikki and Millie would play piano. In particular, her sister Nikki loved ragtime music. His father Harry would join his wife's brothers down in the basement where they would play billiards and roll dice. Maddie's mother was said to be found at poker in Tripoli. Vince's uncle Richard had a Shetland pony, and as a child, Vince once took it for a joyride. He rode it toward Prospect Park, but a truck grazed them, causing no serious injury, but it ended the trip. And his mother's side of the family was so interesting that apparently there was even a newspaper story for September 26, 1924, in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle that outlined how large and diverse it was. This claim comes from the book When Pride Still Mattered by David Marinus. The issue with this is the archives of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle are available online for free, and the search engine is actually pretty competent, but I found nothing from that date or surrounding dates. I even did a search from 1914 to 1930, just in case he got the date and year both wrong, and still nothing. So either this came from a September 26, 1924 edition of the paper that wasn't included in the archive, or perhaps the author listed the wrong publication. Papers can have early and late editions of the same date, so that remains a possibility it's from an alternate edition, but I cannot confirm this. That being said, it's interesting to go over the archives of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, as this was one of the papers that would have been read by people in Lombardi's neighborhood. For example, in 1924, they interviewed a 102-year-old Long Island woman who was complaining about how revealing the clothing of women was in 1924. This was too scandalous for her. And the paper would list the schedule of the radio channels for that day, and they would even give some recommendations for what radio shows to check out. Going over this is really interesting, knowing that Vince Lombardi's own father might have held one of these papers in his hands, reading it while Vince was off playing, although from my research, his father primarily read the New York Evening Journal. For Lombardi's family, religion wasn't just a once-a-week thing. Instead, it intertwined with many other areas of his life. When his mother made bread, she wouldn't just do it for her family, but also for the priests. His father may not have been as devout, but his mother definitely was, and in this way, Lombardi really took after her. He would join his mother in prayers to St. Jude and St. Anthony, the patron saints of their family. In fact, it was at the age of 12, while serving as an altar boy, that he first had the desire to become a priest. Lombardi was sponsored at church by Sonny Jim Fitzsimmons, who trained horses, although Lombardi viewed himself as too big to be a jockey, and the thought of being a future owner wasn't something that seemed realistic. When it came to athletics, he had issues with his eyesight, so he'd only go so far in baseball. Instead, football became his game of choice, and this was a case of him instantly liking the game. Lombardi wrote, "From the first contact on, football fascinated me." He first played it in a semi-organized fashion when he was 12, although this was a sandlot league composed of young men arranging the game themselves without adults present. Despite this, they actually had their own pads and uniforms, and with Vince playing fullback, they represented Sheepshead Bay. How they went about getting their own pads and uniforms without adult intervention is not fully explained. Perhaps only some of them have those. Lombardi turned 12 in 1925, and sporting goods stores did exist back then. In fact, getting back to the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, you can see them specifically mentioning sporting goods stores in Lombardi's area, and you can even see ads for other types of stores that also sold sports equipment. So it's possible they got them there, or maybe there was some equipment also available at schools or churches. It's unclear, but regardless, Lombardi was able to play football, and from the very first start, he was enthralled. When Lombardi would return home from playing, his father Harry, demonstrating the mental toughness he instilled in him, would say, "Hurt is in your mind." That isn't to say Lombardi's father was completely rigid with everything. It was mentioned that Harry would cheat to win at Scrabble by making up words. Scrabble didn't come out until 1938, so unless the family got confused about an earlier game that was similar to Scrabble, this was obviously an older story. And in terms of Lombardi's dinner schedule, when he was a kid, Thursday nights were spaghetti nights. Lombardi's father was known to use red hot peppers over the noodles. With his brother-in-laws, Mac and Pete, Lombardi's father would sometimes cook steaks and wake up Lombardi to share in the late-night meal. And Lombardi had his own set of personal chores and responsibilities to do, and if he didn't do them, Lombardi said, "I was rebuked, and not orally, I might add." This was an old-school, early 1900s, loving but very firm Italian-American family. And in terms of handling his younger brothers and sisters, his sister Madeline was put in charge of watching them, but if something went wrong, Lombardi was to deal with the actual punishment. That being said, Lombardi could be a hypocrite, and Madeline did catch him smoking, which she brought to the attention of their parents. After his punishment, Lombardi chased after Madeline to get after her for snitching. After finishing 8th grade at PS 206, He decided to go to high school at the Cathedral College of the Immaculate Conception. The only issue with this, though, is the school had no football team. In class, while studying to be a future priest, Lombardi studied Latin and Greek. I saw one documentary that claimed when Lombardi became a high school basketball coach, he had never really played the sport before, but this is false. He played center. Due to his commanding presence, he was named president of Class B of a section of 35 classmates for 4 straight years. Rather than moving from classroom to classroom throughout the day, he and his other students stayed in one with different priests coming in to teach various subjects. One interesting trivia about this time in high school is he had the nickname Tony, which not only did he not use this at home, but he didn't have this moniker at any other point in his entire life. And dating girls was out of the question for the school. Those who were caught doing this faced suspension. Only about a third of the students lasted 4 years at the seminary. Lombardi ended up leaving himself in 1932. According to his own words, Lombardi said he realized he was not intended to be a priest. How much Lombardi's love of football led him to transferring is up for debate, but by leaving that school and going to St. Francis, he would be able to play it again. He took a $150 scholarship at the school for tuition and books, where he would be coached by St. Francis's Harry Kane. The team practiced in August at Camp Alverno in Centerport, New York. When school began, though, they went back to Brooklyn, where they practiced in what pretty much amounted to a dirt yard. Lombardi was a running back, although St. Francis assistant coach Tut Maggio tried to persuade him to be a lineman, but to no avail. He would stay at the back position for the time being. The season got off to a little bit of a rough start, as in one of the earlier games when they lost to Erasmus Hall, which has led at quarterback a young Sid Luckman, who would later go on to start for the Chicago Bears. Things would pick up after that, though, as the team won 5 out of 6 matches that year, bringing down both Brooklyn Prep and Brooklyn Tech and capturing the Catholic Championship for St. Francis. As far as what attention Lombardi got from looking over newspaper accounts, it seems he was noticed. However, it was not to the point where in every single article he would be mentioned, so it wasn't quite at Sid Luckman levels of fame. In fact, the November 4th, 1932 edition of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle talks about what a good year they were having under Coach Kane. However, Lombardi's name isn't mentioned by name anywhere in the article. However, in the November 6, 1932 edition, not only is he talked about, he's called a star player and a photo of him is shown. And in that same edition, another photo of him is also featured, so he got 2 pics of him in the paper in one day. However, Eddie Bick, who was a teammate of Lombardi's, had a story published on December 3rd, 1932, and in it, Bick lists his top high school football players he thought were the best in his area, and while he names other St. Francis teammates, Lombardi's name is once again absent. He did, however, name Sid Luckman. So, mixed results. That being said, football filled him with a sense of passion and purpose, and this would take him to his college career at Fordham. New York had a lot going on in terms of football during the early 1930s. In addition to Fordham, he also had New York University and Columbia. When Lombardi accepted a scholarship to go to Fordham, this may have been partially influenced by his cousin, Richie Itzo, who was already attending there. There were 432 men in Lombardi's freshman class, and one of them would become very important to his future later, Wellington Mara, whose father owned the New York Giants. And if you're curious where Wellington lived during that time period, he was at 975 Park Avenue, and this is what it looks like now. It was a bit of distance from Fordham in the Bronx to Lombardi's childhood home, but he was able to find room and board there. Lombardi's roommate was Jim Lawler, who played tackle and was originally from Astoria in Queens, and some of the things they would eat together at a training table included lamb chops and steaks, and they played pool at Dealey's recreation room. Speaking of Dealey, Lombardi lived in the 5th floor of that building, and he woke up at 6:30 each morning to put on a coat and tie to go to chapel for daily mass before getting breakfast and attending class. And as another side note, Lombardi studied French there, branching out from his previous Greek and Latin studies. The schedule was rigid as class attendance was mandatory. Lombardi had to be back at his room by 8 o'clock, and lads had to go out at 10:30. Only a few days of practice passed before Fordham coach Jim Crowley saw Lombardi play fullback, and due to his lack of speed, Crowley decided to make him move to the line. Although he was nearsighted and colorblind, he was able to make it work, so he became a guard. As an interesting coincidence, Coach Jim Crowley actually began his career in Green Bay in high school in 1920, and his coach there was Curly Lambeau, who would soon get in on the ground floor of the Green Bay Packers. After high school, Crowley ended up at Notre Dame. It was here that he was coached by the legendary Newt Rockne, who was called Swede by his players, as supposedly Rockne once asked Crowley if there was anything dumber than a dumb Irishman, and Crowley responded by saying, "A smart Swede." Crowley would play halfback, and would become one of the four horsemen of Notre Dame, and later he would play for the Green Bay Packers in 1925. However, Pro Football Reference lists him being there for only 2 games. In regard to Lombardi being relatively small but still playing guard, the size standards were different in those days. Lombardi wasn't that fast, but he had short bursts of speed. Despite the location of Fordham, many of the players, unlike Lombardi, were not from New York, but from instead outside the area, such as Pierce, who was from Biddeford, Maine, Leo Paquin from Brockton, Massachusetts, Joe Dolkey, the fullback, was from Lowell, Andy Powell, the quarterback and kicker, and Al Gursky were both from Bristol, Connecticut, and Frank Mott, another running back, was from New Haven. During Lombardi's freshman year in 1933, they spent much of their time practicing Notre Dame's box offense. Lombardi and Pierce, the team's other guards, spent hours practicing their moves and sweeps. It's here that he went by the nickname Butch, at least to his teammates. That being said, despite his toughness, his freshman year was marred by injuries. He missed 3 freshman games with a broken ankle. Things, however, would start to look up the next year. Injuries to the multiple starters in 1934 led to him getting playing time in a 57-0 defeat at Westminster of Pennsylvania. The next week, the team took a train to Boston College. As shown in this article, the Fordham Rams were favored to beat Boston, and it mentioned Lombardi might play. They were right in both counts, with Fordham coming on top 6-0. After the game, the papers hyped up Lombardi, who now weighed 200 pounds, at least on paper. In reality, he was still around 183. In weekly practice, Wednesdays were the most physical. Coach Crowley held his practices in private, without the prying eyes of other students or the media. They even had one odd bit of practice where 2 players would square up against one another. Each player would hold one of their legs behind their backs, and while hopping on one foot, would try to knock the other player down, which Crowley believed helped with balance. It was during one of the scrimmages one day that Lombardi charged into the line, carrying the ball. However, after the pile-up was over, he didn't get up. He had been kicked so hard in the gut, he couldn't move, and he had to be carried from the field. That night, Lombardi felt so queasy he couldn't eat, but he decided to carry on anyway. The next day in practice, however, Lombardi collapsed. It turned out he was bleeding internally. He would have to spend some time in the infirmary to recover. To help his stomach deal better with the situation, he was put on a diet of soft foods such as ice cream, bananas, and milk. He would miss the next game, where Fordham fell to St. Mary 14-9. However, before the game, the New York Post did give Lombardi a shout-out, mentioning his injury and hyping up his importance to the team. The following Thursday, he decided to get back into practice. However, he was weakened in his condition, and so he couldn't do much. His playing time was inconsistent for the rest of the season, with Fordham finishing with a 5-3 record. Things were about to improve from Lombardi, though, and not just in football. Meeting women was not something easy to do at Fordham. Even the cheerleaders were men, although that wasn't unusual at that point in time. Up until now, Lombardi's experience with women was very limited. However, his roommate Jim Lawler had a cousin at Fordham whose 2 sisters, Marie and Marge, lived not far from campus at 2564 Creston Avenue. Marie had studied to be a nurse but got sick and dropped out. She was German Catholic on her father's side and Irish Catholic on her mother's. Well, Jim started bringing Lombardi and other players to their apartment to hang out on the weekends, and this is where Marie and Lombardi first met. She liked his dark hair and maturity, and she would soon become his girlfriend. Getting back to social life in general, one of the places mentioned that Lombardi and his friends would go to was the Riviera restaurant off of King Bridge, which served Italian food. I wasn't able to find any restaurant by that name in that particular location of New York, so the place has either closed down, moved, or changed its name. One day, Jen, Lombardi, and Marie went down to Fairhaven, where her family had a residence. After swimming, she told her father, "I'm going to marry that man." Her father told her no, however, because he was Italian. Marie's father was a New York stockbroker, and he didn't like the idea of his daughter marrying the son of an Italian butcher. However, fortunately for Marie and Lombardi, he didn't have any real leverage, as due to internal family drama, she wasn't living with her father, but instead with her mother, who evidently didn't have the same objections. Lombardi would give Marie gifts, calling her Ree for short, and she became his biggest cheerleader. In fact, when she encountered Ed Franco, a lineman who came to Fordham a year after Lombardi, she told Franco to his face, "So, you're Ed Franco. You're the fellow trying to take away my boyfriend's job." She bet him a box of candy he couldn't do it. Lombardi would bring Marie home several times after his sophomore year, but this time the Lombardi family had moved to a house on the corner of Avenue S and 29th. Lombardi's mother was hesitant with Marie, as she was protective. Lombardi's brother Harold, who liked Marie, said, "My mother was a very dominant woman, and she would never relinquish Vin." His sister Madeline also became friends with Marie. However, she considered Marie to be aloof, stating, I don't remember ever showing emotion like I would. Madeline later said, I thought she was pretty cold, but to an Italian, if you weren't Italian, I guess everybody seemed cold. Vince and Marie would never part, and 1935 would bring even more good things to Lombardi's plate. That year, Lombardi was interviewed by the Fordham publicist and revealed his favorite actors were Leslie Howard, Anne Harding, and Helen Hayes, and his favorite author was Richard Halliburton, who would write about his travels around the world. A movie ticket then cost a quarter, and he and his friends would go see films at the Paramount Theater. 25 cents was also the cost of a 16-inch pizza off of Arthur Avenue, and they received free tickets to New York Giants games at the Polo Grounds. Well, technically free tickets. They still had to pay the sales tax. Tickets to Fordham football games were 50 cents, provided you weren't sitting in the bleachers or in a box seat, which would then set you back $1.10 and $3.30 respectively. Using the BLS inflation calculator, 50 cents in 1935 would be equivalent to roughly $10.91 as of this recording. Father Aloysius J. Hogan, Fordham's president, was said to offer coaching advice to Crowley on a regular basis, despite the fact that he apparently didn't know what he was talking about. He would smoke his pipe and give Coach Crowley tips on what to do in the next game, tips that Crowley would ignore. After one loss, Hogan said, I helped out as much as I can, but the exigencies of this job are endless, and I cannot be in two places at one time. If this recounting is accurate, where a nice but clueless father was thinking he was helping with his coaching wisdom, then that's unintentionally funny. Coach Crowley wasn't above using tricks to motivate his players. In a rather bizarre story, Lombardi said Crowley told the team he'd been working with a scientist from the Alps, and he invented a pill that he said would give players superhuman strength. It was, of course, just a sugar pill. I don't know why the scientist being in the Alps was relevant, but it takes my mind to this clip.
See what happens when you find a stranger in the Alps?
In Lombardi's junior year, he started at right guard, but he injured his shoulder in a game against Vanderbilt and lost his starting role to Ed Franco, who would go on to become a star on the line. Even with limited playing time now, Lombardi still had a problem with injuries. He twisted his ankle against Pitt and got his lower teeth knocked out against St. Mary, causing him to wear a bridge for the rest of his life. On a side note, the program for that game has an ad that mentions 18-year-old whiskey. The only issue is, even though Prohibition was over, it was in full swing for most of that whiskey's existence, so to openly say they were storing alcohol during the 1920s was rather interesting, but perhaps in the law there was a loophole for this. 2 ties and a loss to Purdue dropped Fordham from the national rankings. That being said, they did beat Pittsburgh, and this set them up for a match against NYU, which was undefeated, but Fordham thought, due to NYU's easier schedule, they could take out the team. Before the game, the New York Evening Journal reported that Fordham's players, running back Joe Maniaci and tackle Amerino Sarno, were approached by 2 people offering $1,000 to throw the game. Maniaci was told to fumble, and Sarno was told to miss tackles. Instead of accepting the offer, however, they reported it to their coach, and this angered the Fordham team due to the lack of respect. In front of 75,000 fans at Yankee Stadium, Fordham beat NYU 21-0, and due to Sarno getting into a fight during the game and thus being ejected, Lombardi was able to get some playing time. After the game, however, Father Harold Mulquin, the prefect at St. John's Hall where the players lived, questioned Maniaci and Sarno as police detectives had doubted the gambling story. They admitted they made it up, but said it was to inspire the team. That victory would cause Fordham to get back into the rankings, finishing at number 11 in the country. Before the 1936 season began, permanent disaster almost happened to Lombardi's football future as he got into a shower fight after fellow player Richard Healy asked someone to stand next to Lombardi to see who had darker skin. Lombardi tackled Healy and started punching him. The fight was broken up, and Healy, to his credit, says he later regretted that and it agonized him for years. When the new president of Fordham, Father Robert Gannon, heard about this, he suspended both players for the team. Lombardi said, I thought that was the end of my career. Coach Crowley intervened and talked to Father Gannon, getting Lombardi reinstated into the football program. The fact that Crowley had been the butt of at least one anti-Irish joke in college may have at least partially influenced him to vouch for Lombardi, as perhaps he felt some understanding, and Healy admitted he made an anti-Italian remark instead of denying it, which also helped things. Although according to the story, there were multiple witnesses, so Healy trying to lie and say he never made that comment would have really been an option. However, if you go by Leo Paquin's account, a teammate who was there when the fight happened, He made no mention of Father Gannon getting involved and instead framed it as a case of Crowley enforcing the suspension by making sure it was short so Lombardi didn't miss a game. Maybe Father Gannon did get involved and Paquin wasn't privy to the details, but there's a little bit of a contradiction in how this went down. Another fight occurred off campus when Marie invited Lombardi and roommate Lawler to attend a dance at a hotel. As he entered, somebody said, "Who's the little wop?" And Vince, without saying anything, turned around and punched him in the mouth. As they ran away from the hotel, police showed up asking them where the fight was, and Vince said, "Right up there," as they hurried away. Before the 1936 season started, there was buzz about this Fordham team being special. Edwin B. Dooley, a writer for the New York Sun, wrote, "Ram team may be best in history of institution." That was quite a claim, but he backed it up by mentioning their 7-man line, the 7 blocks of granite. In particular, one player, the center Alex, and I'm not even going to attempt to say his last name, who was known by his easier to say nickname Woji, was being promoted for All-American. The previously mentioned Ed Franco and Alibaba Bobrovsky were moved out from the guard position, and this left room for Lombardi to settle in at right guard. So the final lineup for 1936 was set, and starting from left to right, it featured Paquin, Franco, Pierce, Woji, Lombardi, Bobrovsky, and Drews. And of course, in those days, the players played both offense and defense, and on defense, this is where the 7 blocks of granite could really shine. The Fordham Ram weekly column interviewed different players to get their thoughts on the upcoming season. Frank Mott, captain and halfback, thought Pittsburgh would be trouble as he had 53 points in the first game. Franco, the former rival to Lombardi, had been moved to tackle and was looking at playing Southern Methodist for thrills. And Lombardi said he had a score to settle with Purdue as they beat Fordham in the previous year. Fordham got off to a great start, beating Franklin and Marshall 66-7. The next opponent was SMU, who traveled by train to reach New York. That Friday morning before the game, demonstrating that college's desire to put on a show, SMU performed at a rodeo in Madison Square Garden. All that pageantry was for nothing, though, as Fordham won 7-0. The lone score came after Fordham player Johnny Locke intercepted a pass and returned it for a touchdown. Locke was a little sick after the game, as while running in for a touchdown, he had swallowed some tobacco, thus demonstrating what a different time it was, because it's one thing to dip on the sidelines, but another thing to still have it in your mouth and the actual field during gameplay. Lombardi was known then for constantly talking during the game, trying to motivate his fellow players to get them to be even better. Frick Lee, the future college football Hall of Fame coach, who was an assistant that was in charge of the line, said that Lombardi was the most intense player he ever had. On game day, after breakfast, Fordham Rams would get on their bus on their way to the Polo Grounds, singing songs such as "She Told Me She Loved Me, But Oh How She Lied," and the Fordham Fat song, "The Fordham Ram." And this was a sign of things to come if you were paying attention. Chuck Noll, the famous coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers during the dynasty in the 1970s, said he didn't believe too much in the rah-rah strategy of motivating players because he said after you get that speech, it only lasts for so long, and he wanted players that were already motivated. While there's something to be said about this mentality ignores long-term results as someone as emotive and intense as Lombardi. Saying one speech a game usually isn't enough, but this is an incomplete depiction of Lombardi because he never took the foot off the brake, and this constant, everyday push, not just during games, but during practice, had residual effects on players. After a while, players started pushing themselves as a habit because, as Lombardi mentioned, winning was a habit. Another factor was authenticity. Lombardi, his entire coaching career, never once had a team with a losing record. When he said he knew how to win, this wasn't someone who didn't know what they were doing, who hoped things would work out. He could back up what he was saying, and later players would see this. In addition to that, to match his intensity, he had the intelligence. Watch videos on YouTube when Lombardi talks about coaching, and you can see how he broke down the game to its individual parts, not unlike a mechanical engineer. Another high-profile game came against St. Mary. While playing against them, Crowley set his backfield in motion numerous times. However, referee J.P. Egan determined the backs had not come to complete stop during these many shifts, and this led to 7 penalties being called on them. St. Mary took a 6-0 lead. However, Eddie Powell threw a touchdown pass, but with the extra point, Fordham won 7-6. This game helped put further focus on Fordham's defensive line, which hadn't allowed a single team to score more than 7 points against them. The 7 blocks of granite were dominating. After starting off 4-0, the prospect of playing in the Rose Bowl began to seem more and more like a possibility. In their next game against Pitt, however, it was a scoreless tie. Still, though, they were doing their part in defense. Pitt marched down toward the goal line, and on 4th down with 1.5 yards to go, Wojcicki burst through and tackled the Pitt running back, holding them on downs. After it was over, the Fordham fans stormed the field, acting as if they won. Still unbeaten, though, Fordham stood on top of the football world in the East, and the momentum picked up after they beat Purdue 15-0. All that remained were 2 matches, one against Georgia, and to finish off the season, a game against NYU. Against Georgia, Fordham running back Frank Mott caught a pass and ran in for a score. However, the Georgia defense was scratching his face, and Mott claimed they stuck their fingers in his eyes, gouging him. Mott fought back by punching, and this led to him being ejected. Without the running back, the offense sputtered and ended in a 7-7 tie. Lombardi said, "Some of our better players behaved as if we had already finished the season undefeated and had received and accepted the bid to the Rose Bowl we all wanted so badly." In their last game against NYU, they did even worse, suffering their first defeat of the season, losing 6-7. Missing the Rose Bowl affected the whole team, but after the season was over, on a more positive note, Lombardi has admitted himself as one of the 7 blocks of granite, earning a special place in college football history. His playing career was almost over now, but bigger and better things were awaiting him. It just required patience and perseverance. When we continue, we will cover Lombardi's time after college and the steps that led to him coaching. I hope you appreciate this video. In it, I didn't want to be a near clone of so many other ones before it, but instead I wanted an in-depth deep dive covering Lombardi from angles not normally seen. We found out on Thursday nights Lombardi's mom would often cook spaghetti, and his dad liked to modify it by putting hot red peppers on it. We learned about Vince's joyride with his uncle's Shetland pony, and we learned about where Lombardi liked to hang out with his friends while at Fordham. This first part was littered with minutia, but I think the little things can add up and help make Lombardi feel more three-dimensional. And as for the sources of this information, in addition to the newspapers of the time, we can thank Lombardi's own family, including but not limited to Jill Lombardi, Harold Lombardi, and Madeline Warner. And so we'll continue showing what we can to draw a fuller picture of Lombardi so that you can know him better and see how and why he changed people's lives so much. That's all for now. See you next time.